Welcome everyone to the first fall ReproNim webinar. We're delighted to have Chris Mungall here, who is a senior scientist in the Environmental Genomics and Systems Biology Division at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, where he heads the Biosystems Data Science Department. Chris's research interests center around capture, computational integration, and dissemination of biological research data, and the developments of methods for using this data to elucidate biological mechanisms, understanding the health of humans and of the planet. I've had the pleasure of working with Chris a little bit on a couple of different fronts, and this kind of spans work that we're doing in the Dandy project, in ReproNim, in the Bridge to AI project, which I'm happy to see some people here from as well. And we have adopted kind of seeing LinkML, which Chris is going to present to us today and talk about various elements of it as a core component in moving biomedical ontologies and our work around integrating biomedical data forward. Uh, with that, I'm going to pass this on to Chris, who will give us a presentation, and we hope to have plenty of times for questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Satra, for the intro. Yeah, no, and thank you all for the invite. It's great to be speaking to you all. I see some familiar faces here. So I'm going to be talking about, as Satra said, the LinkML framework and how LinkML can be used to create AI-ready data sets using biomedical ontologies. So I thought I'd set the scene with this figure from a nice recent review by Marion Martin. I think probably everyone on this call is familiar with, just to kind of like highlight, even just in the neuroscience domain, the sheer diversity of different data resources and different data sets that we have. So this is counting the number of distinct data repositories grouped by data type. So we see we've got kind of like, kind of clinical data, EEG data, EMG data, fMRI data, and so on. In some cases, there's, as many as 6 different repositories for one individual data type. And then these all have to, essentially kind of like connect together and talk to each other. And so Marianne kind of mapped out the landscape of some of these different data resources and how they all might connect together. So, I'm sure you'll see many familiar resources on here, Dandy that Satra mentioned, Spark, and so on. But of course, the major challenge here is, as it is throughout all of the biosciences, is that if we want to be able to gain insights from some of these disparate different data resources, data repositories, we need to be able to integrate them, and we need to be able to interoperate with the data if we're able to derive insights by, for example, combining omics data, imaging data with perhaps kind of clinical observations or phenomic data. And this holds true for the brave new world of AI as well, whether we're using kind of like kind of classic machine learning methods or newer GPT-based transformers. We essentially need to be able to integrate this data together and align it such that we can build large enough data sets that we can derive insights from. So common vocabularies, a common language in which to speak, is a necessary prerequisite for being able to interoperate this kind of data. If 2 different databases can essentially speak using the same terms, then we're on the path to interoperation and data integration. And we have no shortage of terms or ontologies to choose from. Many of you, I think, are familiar with the BioPortal resource, which is the main one of the main repositories for ontologies in the biosciences. There are over 1,000 different ontologies within BioPortal. I'm part of something called the OBO Foundry, the Open Biomedical Ontologies Foundry. This curates a smaller subset of these ontologies, on the order of 100 or so, that are explicitly designed to work well together and to interoperate with one another. And then within the neuroscience domain, we have things like SciCrunch and the NIDM terminologies. And even these kind of like smaller, kind of like curated subsets of ontologies themselves often have like huge numbers of perhaps overwhelming numbers of terms within them. So almost like 500,000 terms within the NIDM terminologies. Within this kind of like, cornucopia of ontologies, there's some ontologies that maybe some of you are familiar with. So I work on something called the Uberon multi-species anatomy ontology. This essentially provides terms for each individual body part within the human body or within the bodies of other organisms, going down to individual kind of brain regions and subsets of brains that you might also find in some kind of neuroanatomical atlas as well. So ontologies like Uberon are widely used within the biosciences, but yet we still see that they are vastly underutilized in cases where they should be. So this is analysis that was done by the CFDE, the Common Fund Data Ecosystem. They have a set of FAIR metrics or rubrics, and they use this to evaluate a number of data sets within the Common Fund Data Ecosystem. One of those metrics was that a relevant anatomical part is present and observable in the Uberon ontology. And then they essentially looked through all of these different data sets and saw how many conformed to this. And it turned out that none of them did, even though many of them were had relevant metadata that needed to be anchored within some kind of like human or animal body site. They weren't actually using a standard ontology here. They were just using maybe free text, or maybe they didn't even supply this information at all. And so as a result of this, we have significantly poorer interoperability among databases. If we're not speaking the same language, then it's much harder for us to combine these data sets together and to compare them. But even in cases where databases do make use of the same ontologies, this is necessary but not sufficient for interoperation, because these databases may themselves use they may structure the data in different ways. They may have different data dictionaries, they may shape things differently, and they may have kind of like schemas that are essentially incompatible. And the reality is that we often inhabit the worst of both worlds. We need to be able to integrate databases that are neither speaking the same language, nor are they using the same shared data structures or schemas. And so a number of many of us were very keen a number of years ago on the promise of the semantic web to be able to solve some of these problems. This is the seminal semantic web publication in Scientific American by Tim Berners-Lee and others. And the vast promise here was that semantic web would enable machines to comprehend semantic documents and data, not human speech and writing. So I think this was a very promising vision, and it's brought us a lot of technology and standards that have been incredibly useful. I know at least some of us on this call have made a great deal of use of these standards, RDF, OWL, and so on. But nevertheless, 25 years or so on from this publication, we're still in this kind of universe where, despite the promises of RDF, a lot of developers and data scientists are essentially resist its usage. The abstractions that RDF give you don't necessarily map well to the abstractions that data scientists and database developers need to use in their day-to-day work. And this is something I myself have kind of like found when I've tried to introduce semantic technologies into a more kind of like traditional data management or database type stack. The data scientists often kind of like don't quite see the need to model things in triples, or what they don't know what Sparkle is. They just want to work, operate on tables. They are used to using tools like Pandas and SQL and so on. And meanwhile, database developers, again, they're more used to kind of more traditional technologies, like using kind of like JSON and JSON schema to structure their data, or perhaps relational databases and SQL DDL, or maybe kind of document stores such as MongoDB and so on. And so what we essentially end up with is this kind of like babel of different kind of ways of thinking about and structuring our data, depending on what community you belong to. I work with a lot of people who develop ontologies who are keen on using kind of OWL as their modeling language. Meanwhile, a lot of the semantic web community have kind of started rejecting OWL and moving on to kind of like shape languages like Shekel and Shex and so on. Against this, going back even prior to OWL existed, there's a standard called ISO 11179, which is used by many of the NIH common data element repositories. There's also other clinical standards like FHIR, and meanwhile, kind of developers tend to be more comfortable with things like Pydantic and JSON schema. And your average kind of like working kind of like scientist is probably just happier working in an environment that involves kind of exchanging Excel files around. So this we essentially see LinkML in one way as being a lingua franca, a kind of way, a kind of common modeling language that can be used to bridge all of these different perspectives on how we might model data. And our target audience here isn't necessarily someone who's a kind of an advanced semantic modeler. Our target audience here is really just typical data scientists or data modelers, software engineers, kind of curators. And our goal is really not to kind of like force semantics and semantic web technology on people, but to really kind of like bring semantics to these developers in a way that they can is going to be more comfortable and more familiar with them. And our major goal here is to essentially allow people to work in concert with some of the existing technologies that they're already familiar with. So the idea is you can use LinkML, and then if you're working with people who are familiar with the semantic web stack, you can compile that LinkML down into formats like OWL or SHEX or Shackle or JSON-LD. Or if you're working with more traditional database developers, you can compile the LinkML representation down into Pydantic classes or SQL tables or JSON schema or anything like that as well. So it aims to really be the kind of like a unifying layer amongst all of these different these different ways of modeling data. So we see the LinkML ecosystem is really composing of 3 different parts. There is the LinkML standard itself, the LinkML meta model. LinkML is actually modeled within LinkML, and it is intended to kind of essentially stand apart. Anyone can implement tooling against LinkML, but we also provide a number of tools that can help people get started with using the framework. Again, these tools are addressed at different kinds of audiences. And then finally, the third and perhaps the most important component of this is the LinkML community itself, an open and inclusive community of people who are using LinkML or contributing to its development or contributing data models and so on. So I'll walk through these three different components in order. So first, the LinkML standard itself. So it's LinkML essentially provides you with a metadata model that helps you structure your data. In abstract terms, you could see this meta model as consisting of a number of different elements. The core element is a schema. Schemas can import other schemas. Schemas consist of things such as classes and slots. There's other aspects to the meta model themselves, but these are the core elements. What does this actually look like in practice? So in practice, the way most people use LinkML is that they will develop a LinkML schema that models the data within their domain. And the most common way of authoring this is as a simple YAML document. So YAML provides a nice kind of hierarchical syntax. There's a lot of good support for this with kind of like tools that developers may be familiar with, like integrated development environments and so on. It allows you to essentially kind of like richly structure and nest your data. So what I'm showing here on the left is just a really simple example minimal LinkML schema. This is for modeling just people. So we've got a class called person here, and then the person might have a number of different attributes. And so this is kind of this is actually how a number of people just this is the main thing that they get from LinkML. Is just a simple standard way of being able to author a data dictionary. So if you're exchanging kind of like TSVs or Excel files around, and you want to provide just a standard way of describing the different column headings and what is expected in each column, maybe this is all you need from LinkML, basically just a standard description of the column headings, maybe some additional metadata saying which columns you expect to have values in, whether these columns are intended to be strings or whether they're intended to reference other parts of the schema as well. But what this also allows us to do is to gradually introduce additional semantics, and these are always optional, and people can kind of start layering them in as they feel comfortable. So what we do is we provide a way in which people can essentially map each individual element of their schema to existing schemas and vocabularies. This has a lot of benefits. It allows you to essentially export your data to formats like RDF and JSON-LD. It helps make the meaning of your schema much more explicit. And we think of these as being data integration hooks as well. It allows you to develop your schema as you see fit, but at the same time, it allows you to say, well, this part in my schema actually, uses the standard data element that I've drawn from another schema, such as schema.org or biolink or something like that. And essentially it provides you a way to sort of like hook in integration. And so here's one of the advantages of this. We think of this in terms of something we call stealth graphs. So the basic idea here is that in mapping each of the schema elements into RDF elements, it essentially gives you an automated way of mapping your data into RDF and thus into an RDF graph. So just this table here that's been described with our LinkML schema, we've said that each row on the table is an instance of a schema.org person, and then this the nose column is actually a pointer to an identifier in the same table itself. So we can see nose is kind of like it's using a schema called friend of a friend here, and this essentially gives you a mapping into graphs for all of your data. So I think this is a good point to introduce one of the original LinkML schemas, which I know some of you are familiar with and are using. And it's something called biolink. So biolink is a knowledge graph schema that is intended to model all of the kind of core different data types that you might find in the biosciences. So genomic entities, things like genes and different genomic elements, anatomical entities such as brain regions, cell types, phenotypes, drugs, organisms, and so on, and also allow you to kind of model how each of these things are related to one another. And so, one of the main drivers here for using LinkML was a lot of the flexible modeling capabilities. Within BioLink, you can essentially kind of like model class hierarchies. So you can essentially make an ontology type model. So you could have, for example, a general class such as anatomical entity, and it may have kind of subclasses like cell type and gross anatomical structure and so on. But it also gave us other advantages as well, the ability to validate some of these property graph schemas, and also to really a kind of social advantage of being able to bring in expertise from people with varying amounts of technical knowledge to all essentially contribute to this schema. And in addition, we knew we wanted to be able to integrate and hook into existing ontologies that model each of these things in more detail, such as the Uberon anatomy ontology for anatomical structures. So this was one of the original schemas that were developed using LinkML. So another one of the core use cases in LinkML that is, I think, common to probably all of the data sets that those I know on this call who are making use of, is this support for something we call value sets or enumerations. So the basic idea here is maybe you have a schema that's modeling maybe different kinds of nanomaterials. Each nanomaterial might have properties like its identifier or its name, but you may also want to model the morphology of the nanomaterial as well. So the simplest way to do this is just by modeling morphology as a string. That has the advantage, it's nice and flexible, but maybe it's just a little bit too flexible because people can put any string that they want in here. We may want to constrain the set of terms such that we can make our data comparable. So just as with standard kind of like relational database schemas or JSON schemas, you can bring in structures that are called enums or enumerations, where you can essentially list as a kind of like drop down all of the different permissible values that this field may be allowed to take on. So this is a good start. It helps us standardize. But do we know that these terms that we have chosen, are they actually like standard terms that other people in other databases may be using? Well, this is where other features come in, where we can essentially map each of the individual permissible values into terms in existing ontologies, such as the Kebi ontology for chemical entities, which also covers things like nanostructure morphologies as well. So this can essentially allow us to have our own individual terminologies within each of our own individual schemas, but yet have them be mapped to common identifiers in some existing standard, allowing our data to be more interoperable. Now, this is all well and good if you've got maybe like a dozen or so of these terms that you want to enumerate. But what happens if your value set starts getting huge? What if you have you're designing a schema to model your single cell experiments? You've got a field in the schema where the user is allowed to enter the cell type of any neuron. You don't want to just like individually enumerate these, because there could be like thousands and thousands of different neuronal cell types, and of course there are, and there's new ones being discovered all the time using single cell technology. So how would you do this if you just wanted to essentially restrict this to an individual branch from an ontology, such as the cell type ontology? Well, this is where a feature called dynamic value sets, or dynamic enumeration, comes in. And the basic idea here is that you can essentially specify a graph query within your schema and say the values of this field have to be taken from this particular ontology. And you can also optionally start layering in kind of graph queries and say, additionally, they also have to come from the neuron branch of this ontology. Or maybe it allows you a kind of a full Boolean language, such that you can say, also start adding in additional kind of like unions or exclusions and so on, so that you could maybe say exclude any neurons that are not neurons that are known to be found in humans, for example. So this gives you a very flexible way of essentially hooking in different branches of different ontologies into your schema. So one of the kind of a schema I'd like to highlight here is the Genomic Standards Consortium minimal information about any sequence schema. So this is a standard that is actually used by all the major sequencing databases. The essential idea is that when you submit genomic data to GenBank or to ENA, and it's genomic or metagenomic data, there's a lot of metadata that is also important to capture about that. If it's a human skin sample, you need to be able to capture where on the human body that was captured. If it was captured, it was a metagenome sample from like the deep ocean, you want to be able to capture things like the latitude and longitude and the depth, and maybe kind of like biogeochemical parameters of where that sample was captured from. So historically, these standards have essentially been modeled as essentially spreadsheets, which have a number of disadvantages. They can't be used for kind of automated data validation. And as a result of this, you tend to see that a lot of the metadata you'd find in some of these sequencing databases can be somewhat messy. So the GSC have moved towards using LinkML as the framework for which they define their dictionaries of metadata elements. And this has a lot of advantages in being able to essentially more tightly control, to automatically build data submission interfaces, to be able to automatically validate a lot of this data, and to also to develop these standards in a more modular way, such that there's different elements that can be combined together, such that you can have one portion of the schema describing the genome, the other portion of the schema describing the environment, and so on. So moving on to the tool system itself. As I mentioned, anyone can essentially build their own tools for LinkML, but we provide a number of tools for different audiences to help get people started. So we have tools for data modelers, semantic tools, tools for data wranglers, and a number of integrations with existing systems, whether they're existing frameworks like Protobuf or JSON Schema, or existing databases. So One tool that a lot of people find useful to help them get started with their schema or developing standards is something called schema sheets. As I mentioned before, the primary way of authoring a LinkML schema is by authoring a YAML document, but that can be a little bit nerdy or geeky for some people who like to work in a more kind of like spreadsheet oriented world. So the basic idea with schema sheets is that you can essentially have each row in an Excel file or a Google Sheet represent an element from your schema. And this can be really useful if you're developing a standard that is maybe collecting metadata about people or samples or something like that, and you end up having kind of dozens or maybe even hundreds of different pieces of metadata that need to be captured about each one of these. A lot of people are much more comfortable capturing this in a kind of spreadsheet type format. And so you have different rows within this that represent different pieces of metadata about each of your schema elements. So this example shows, again, a simple schema for representing people or organizations. And you can describe each of the different fields and what their cardinality are, what their intended range, what their units are, and also importantly how they map to other schemas such as schema.org as well. And so this can essentially compile down into the native LinkML YAML representation. Now, the reality of developing standards and data models is that you're rarely starting kind of de novo from a blank slate. Often you've got a lot of existing messy data that is maybe conforming to some implicit schema or maybe not even conforming to a schema at all. And you want to find the commonalities on that and essentially use the existing data to drive the initial version of your schema. So we provide a general framework called Schema Automator that uses a number of different techniques that we can allow you to essentially bootstrap a new schema, taking existing semi-structured data sources. It can do things like use ontology APIs, such as the BioPortal API, to start giving you suggestions of how different elements of your schema should be mapped. And the basic idea is you use this as an initial starting point for your schema, you bootstrap your schema, and then you essentially kind of like take over the development from there. And then we're starting to develop kind of like newer AI tools to help with schema development as well. We have something that's quite fun. There's essentially just like a plugin to ChatGPT called the LinkML Schema Helper. And the idea here is you can just interact with it using natural language, or you can even drop pictures in and just ask it to help you build a schema. And it's using a really simple technique where it's got a pre-built prompt that describes and gives examples of existing LinkML schemas. So you can even do something like take a messy kind of whiteboard diagram and drop that in and have its image recognition kind of like scan that to essentially give you a starting point for the schema within that. Yeah, that's all very well, but it kind of locks you into the ChatGPT environment. So we're developing newer tools that can help. You can use AI to help with this kind of schema bootstrapping. So one of the main use cases for having a standard or a data model or a schema is such you can validate data. So maybe you're a data wrangler that is working as part of a data coordination center. You're bringing in submissions and metadata from a number of different sources. You want to be able to kind of like check that all of the metadata conforms to your schema. You don't want to go through and manually check all of this. You want to just use some way of automating this. And so LinkML gives you a number of different options for data validation that can be used to kind of essentially slot into existing frameworks. So maybe you're already working in an environment where people are using a JSON document database such as MongoDB or something like that. In that case, you can essentially turn your LinkML schema into JSON schema, and then essentially just plop that into your existing MongoDB type pipeline and just use JSON schema validation. Or you may be working more in a kind of semantic web stack and you may be using triple stores. You may have kind of like tools that can do validation in Shackle. So you can, in this case, you can essentially compile down to Shackle here as well. And we're starting to build integrations with other databases such that you can do large scale validation on the fly with kind of like billions of rows of data using kind of performant modern data science databases like DuckDB. And we also provide a native LinkML validation feature as well. So one thing to mention is with each of these methods where you essentially compile down to some other representation, sometimes you lose something in the way because LinkML is typically more expressive than some of these other formalisms like JSON schema. So again, if you're a data wrangler and you're part of a data coordination center, or you're somehow kind of like need to bring in data submissions from the community, there's a number of different options for you. Typically you want to avoid building a bespoke new UI for every single data type, because that can be, while it can be fun, it can be kind of expensive. So really you want to take advantage of some solution that will essentially read your schema and develop a UI for you dynamically on the fly. So one of the solutions, there's a number of kind of tools in the LinkML ecosystem here that can help. One is called Data Harmonizer. And this gives you a nice kind of user-friendly JavaScript UI. It's driven entirely by a LinkML schema. So you just give it a schema and it will kind of like give you a spreadsheet type interface. It has full validation baked into it. So it will validate dynamically against the schema as you're entering data and give you useful feedback. But there's a number of other solutions here as well. Ben Dichter from Catalyst Neuroscience developed a kind of LinkML Django integration. I know, Satra, you have been working on a kind of like a pipeline for going from LinkML to Shackle and such that you can use some of the top-rate composer ways of building these data submission type interfaces. James Overton has been developing integrations with a framework called Valve that gives you very kind of like fast, performant LinkML validation over a nice kind of spreadsheet type interface. And if you like, you can also essentially take your LinkML schema and turn it into an Excel template, and then just send those Excel templates out for people to fill in, and it will give you kind of like some level of validation against the schema, although there's a limit to what you can actually do within Excel, of course. So one example of how this is being used is in multi-omics microbiome project. So I'm part of an organization called the National Microbiome Data Collaborative, or NMDC. So we're making use of LinkML for all the different aspects of our data lifecycle, from capturing biogeochemical measurements about environmental samples, right the way through to sample processing, and then the various kinds of omics analyses that you might do over these samples, so genomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, proteomics, together with capturing the full details of all of the different analysis pipelines that get run over these samples. We have a data portal where you can search for this sample data, and we're developing a new LinkML-driven mobile phone data collection device for scientists to use when they're actually out in the field and capturing data and taking kind of like pictures of their samples, and it allows you to essentially capture some of that metadata as you're actually collecting the data, rather than waiting when you get back to the lab afterwards, where you may have forgotten some of the key details. And that's all essentially driven by a LinkML schema behind the scenes. So we have another number of other integrations that people find useful. One of the most important things, with a standard or a schema, is being able to communicate it to a broader audience, and also helping people be able to kind of like find the different metadata elements within the schema. So we have a number of different GitHub pages and Markdown documentation integrations that essentially allow you to take the schema, compile it down into Markdown, compile it down into visual UML style diagrams, such as this mermaid diagram here, such that you can see all of the different elements of your schema, how they relate to one another, as well as integrating with kind of providing example data for that and so on. For database, for software developers, we provide integrations with different modeling frameworks. So one of the most popular ones within the Python universe is something called Pydantic. This provides you with a nice, easy, intuitive way to develop an object class model within Python. And so thanks to the efforts of a number of people, in particular Johnny Saunders, we've got a really nice mature framework for being able to compile two Pydantic objects from LinkML. And this really eases the integration of using LinkML from within a Python environment. And we're starting to build out integrations with a number of other database systems. So this includes document stores like MongoDB and Solr, as well as relational database engines such as DuckDB, graph databases like Neo4j. And the basic idea is that it provides you with a common interface for managing your data using LinkML schemas, using familiar idioms that are drawn from databases such as MongoDB, such you can create collections of data, put these collections into a single database, and make use of these from a command line environment or directly from Python, and write this in such a way that you can be somewhat neutral about the underlying database engine that is you're using. And so this is intended to be an AI-ready store. It implements a pattern that we sometimes call CRUDC. So, CRUD is the create, read, update, delete design pattern that is used for a lot of database systems. And we think, a database system should also support two other operations as well. And these are search and inference. And so the basic idea here is that you can you as a developer or data manager can perform common operations against an API, and this could include things like create, read, update, delete, but it could also include things like searching a database using AI retrieval augmented generation techniques, or it could involve things like validating the database contents using a schema. And these make use of these search and inference paradigms. And the basic idea is that we can be neutral about what kinds of search or what kinds of inference are being used. You can make use of traditional search, you can bind it to the search that might be used within a Solr database, or you can essentially plug in vector search and use this in combination with your existing database system of choice. So I think the way a lot of people are using a lot of these AI search type systems is they end up getting locked into a database such as ChromaDB, which is good for vector search, but may not be as good for your actual data management. So LinkML Store allows you to essentially compose together these systems as you might like. So you can make use of vector search in combination with MongoDB or with Neo4j or with anything else that you might like there as well. And then for the inference, it includes retrieval augmented generation type inference to help populate missing data within your schema, but you can also integrate with more traditional machine learning environments such as scikit-learn as well. And then finally, another newer framework that is part of the LinkML data ecosystem is something called LinkML Map. The basic idea here is that we know we're never going to have the one universal schema to rule them all. There's always going to be different data models and different schemas that are developed by different communities that are tailored towards different kinds of problems or different ways to shape the data. And the ways in which we need to map these schemas can be kind of quite complex, because we often need to dynamically reshape the data on the fly, or you may need to do operations such as unit conversions and so on. So the idea with LinkML Map is that it provides you with a high-level declarative language for which you can specify how your database schema may map to another schema in another database system, or to a common standard such as BioLink. And then just finally onto the perhaps the most important part of the triad that I mentioned earlier, which is the community itself. So we really strive to nurture an open and inclusive community. We have our contributor code of conduct. We have a growing number of people contributing to the ecosystem. The screenshot shows just the people who have made pull requests onto the main LinkML repository itself. And you can see from some of these stats that there's a lot of activity going on here, and I know some of you on this call are definitely part of that. So thank you for your contributions there. We have a number of different ways for us all to interact together. So we make a lot of use of things like the GitHub discussion features, and so this is in addition to the standard issue tracker that we have as well. We've got GitHub discussion set up for doing kind of Q&A and for sharing new ideas or new ideas for working groups and so on. And this is complemented by a number of other mechanisms as well. We're currently squatting in the OBO, Open Bioontologies Slack workspace. We have 2 channels in there. We have a broader community channel, and then we have a smaller developers channel for people who are wanting to contribute to the framework itself. We've also set up a LinkedIn group. We have a slight presence on Mastodon, and we've just launched a YouTube channel as well. So you can use all of these mechanisms for staying up to date with us. We're also very interested in helping catalyze new different working groups, and these working groups can be used to explore kind of a common data model for a particular domain. So for example, there's a group right now called CMDR for the common, I'm blanking on exactly what this stands for, but this is essentially a high-level data model for kind of like clinical research in the vein of OMOP or something like that. We're also interested in working groups who are looking at extensions of the framework. We've got people who are looking at things like extending LinkML to better have multilingual support, or to improve the support for non-Python environments. We've got nascent frameworks for working with TypeScript, for working with R, for working with Java. But these are still areas that we're very much looking to catalyze. And I think one of the success stories here has been the multidimensional arrays working group. So this actually kind of came out of this community here, the neuroscience community, in particular the neurophysiological data modeling community, the Neurodata Without Borders community. So Oliver Rubel and Ryan Lee were interested in using LinkML in combination with NWB for being able to structure their metadata. But they found that the way in which you had to model multidimensional data in LinkML was not particularly efficient, and we kind of came together and decided that we really needed to make multidimensional arrays a first-class feature of the language. And so after a lot of kind of like painstaking work by members of this group with the 1.7 release of LinkML, we now have direct first-class support within the language for being able to model n-dimensional arrays. And so thank you again, and thank you in particular to Satra for helping host a workshop which really catalyzed a lot of the development of this. So I used to show this slide here with the logos of various different kind of like adopters and users of LinkML, but this is rapidly becoming out of date. We are starting to develop essentially a revamp of our LinkML schema registry. Right now we're just tracking everything in a big Google Sheet, and if you're interested, you can contribute your schemas to there. We've got about 200 different entries in there at the moment, and we're just kind of like working through these and trying to kind of like capture some of the metadata in more detail, such that we can have a nice schema registry type site, the same way that you have kind of ontology registries like BioPortal or OBO. And we're definitely interested in ways in which we can harmonize this with work within this community, such as the excellent SciCrunch registries. So yeah, with that, to just summarize, as we all know, data interoperability it's a huge challenge. It's incredibly hard. Ontologies can be a big help here, but they really need to be woven into some of these existing standards. And so LinkML is really designed to be as easy as possible for people to use, and to allow people to start layering in semantics as they need them. It's designed to be flexible in how ontologies can be used and integrated. And it's not intended to compete with existing tool stacks. It's really intended to be able to weave in and integrate with some of these. And finally, it's, we're finding it to be, really not just a way of kind of like interoperating amongst from machine to machine, but it's a way of bringing people together and allowing us to kind of communicate and share, our visions for, how we might structure our data such that it can work better together, and essentially start building new communities for being able to develop some of these standards together. And so with that, I just want to thank all of the many contributors, many who are here. In particular, Sierra Moxon at LBL, who is leading a lot of these efforts, and Matt Brush and Melissa Handel at UNC, and all of the many people who have contributed to this. With that, I think I'll stop and take any questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm going to open it up to the community over here. Please unmute and ask Chris questions. And maybe while we wait for people to digest that entire set of things, I could start off with, as you see LinkML and the tools and connections you've created, kind of keeping up all of these pieces in sync must require some level of effort from the community that you're also building. And some of the challenges I've learned of when I've mentioned LinkML to people who've tried it, oh, this doesn't work. How do you want the community to kind of interact with you in keeping these in sync as the main schema changes or as these links update? Or will AI bots just take over all of that work in the future?
No, I don't think they will take over that work, although we're all, I think many of us are using them to help us with both developing our schemas and developing our code as well. But no, I think one thing that we could do a better job of is communicating the different levels of maturity within different pieces of the LinkML stack. Because on the one hand, we're trying to be as maximally interoperable as possible. We're trying to give people integrations such that they can use this in combination with GraphQL, for example. But some parts of the stack are more are more fluid, but the actual kind of core meta model itself, plus the kind of core support for the core elements like JSON schema integration, Pydantic integration, are much more mature. And these things should, these parts, we're hopefully not seeing, any major issues in how people are using them. So, and even though it may seem that there's a lot of activity around the fringes and kind of like developing kind of like new pieces of the stack or new integration, the LinkML store, for example, is a very new part of this kind of framework. It's much more fluid. Parts of that will change. The actual core meta model itself, we are very, very careful not to introduce any changes that will break anything for people who have developed their schemas already. There will sometimes be new elements that you can use that can allow you to model things in a more compact way. But these things are always introduced in such a way that they should never introduce any breaking changes. And I think this really limits the the amount of coordination that we have to do amongst these different components.
Thank you, Chris. Other questions from the audience? Don't be shy. All right, I'm going to toss in another question, which is the word semantic web. All of us, believed in a lot of the principles and kind of initial considerations. In this current world where you have this balance between schema-driven development, but connections to kind of resorting to graphs and other ways of connecting the dots of the data, do you see some of the standard mechanisms of the semantic web, like Sparkle and others, continue to exist, or would we just subsume that into, and I'm specifically kind of perhaps thinking about the LinkML store that you described
Mhm.
as becoming this new interface to the semantic web, where the semantics remain embedded, but you have a different way of interacting with those semantics.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't see it in terms of like replacing anything. I think the reality of our universes is we're always going to have different, we're never going to have one uniform technology stack, nor would we want to. There's definite advantages to using, semantic web technologies directly for some applications. Yeah, for others, you may be, something like a document store or DocDB may be a better fit for that solution. And even with LinkML Store, it's designed to give you essentially a common interface on top of some of these systems, but it's not designed to replace them. I think there will always be cases where you need to essentially go, behind the scenes and work more directly within the natural data manipulation idiom, whether it's working with pandas or using SQL queries or Sparkle queries or something like that. It's not intended to replace any of these things. It's really just intended to make it easier for humans who are working with these different systems to better work together rather than doing what happens now, which is we often end up in different silos, and these people are developing this awesome triple store over here, and these people are developing this awesome relational database, and there's a lot of the same information in them, and they're doing duplicative work, and they don't have a mechanism in which to communicate what they're doing. I
Oops.
mean, maybe I could also turn it around and just have a kind of question for you all, or maybe you kind of Satra specifically. What do you see as some of the big kind of data interoperation challenges that you're facing within the ReproNim community?
So I think it's not just ReproNim, but the broader neuroscience community has created lots of schemas in various places. And one of the challenges is, and they have built it with various data models in mind. In some cases, RDF, in some cases, JSON schemas, in some cases, uh, ad hoc schemas of various kinds. And I think one of the challenges is will each require a lot of manual effort to bring to this interoperability space of LinkML? Or
Mhm,
is there some automation that could help connect the dots? So I really like some of the efforts on the mapping and the transformers, but I think the underlying details of how to map
mhm, mhm.
is a little bit more challenging because there's a lot of semantics that's in the heads of people who create some of those schemas.
Absolutely, yeah.
And maybe that's a place where if there's a community effort, whether alongside AI agents or assistants,
Mhm,
to bring those together. Because as you said during the talk, people are not going to walk away from at least well-used tools that they have already developed.
mhm, mhm.
And interoperability will require us to interface with those tools and databases in ways that we can bring the information space together. Uh, and LinkML sounds like a solution to that. I mean, that's one of the reasons we had that workshop in Berkeley.
Mhm.
Uh, and so, but that still remains a practical challenge of how to enact that across these different places, whether institutions or consortia that have built their own infrastructure and schemas around it. So if you have some thoughts on, does it require a hackathon? Does it require more than a hackathon? Uh, is there some automation in the pipeline that you can see that would help kind of connect the dots across related but distinct efforts, right? They're both dealing with neuroscience, but they've implemented things quite differently.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on the main points there. I think, as I'm sure you're aware, like, generative AI works, quite well for being able to do certain kind of like advanced pattern manipulation tasks, taking this schema over here, this schema over here, figuring out, how the different pieces map together. But ultimately it's that human element, and it's the kind of like implicit knowledge about why this schema was developed in this particular way. And I think there's no substitution there for something like the Berkeley Hackathon, where we got together and hashed out some of these different things.
So we hope we'll have a few more hackathons in the space with the LinkML community to do things. I know we're coming up on time. Chris is available through many routes to contact if there are questions around LinkML, but I would encourage joining the OBO community on Slack and the LinkML GitHub community where you can have direct access to this community. Thank you so much, Chris. This has been fantastic, and it's great to see how LinkML has come along and how we hope we can use these technologies and tools across many projects. And uh, whether it's Bridge to AI, whether it's ReproNim, whether it's Dandy, whether it's ByCan, I hope it also provides, again, that glue that as these infrastructural resources and projects are coming online in the space of modern technology, that LinkML provides that lingua franca for us to come together in some way. So thank you, Chris. Very appreciative.
Yeah. Mhm.